morning, I have the distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Ms. Ursula Schaefer Cruz, who was the former Vice President of Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development of ABB. And I'm very proud to say that it was during her time that we started this youth debate in Hanoi. And therefore, I would like to request everyone to give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I know it's early and it's not so easy to get into the conference center, but we are already quite improved, so I'm really very glad that I can get in with you. As Fernanda said, we opened this youth debate forum last year at the annual meeting in Hanoi, and this is, so to speak, the second in the row, and I hope we will follow more. We did this last year together with Plan International, and this year we have Plan International and the University of the Philippines Debate Society, and then we have the representatives from the universities who won the competition, which took place last month. I just wanted to state here that I think it's very important to have the voice of the youth, and we cannot stress this more and more. We have heard we have over 650 million young people living in the Asia-Pacific region, and you really should speak up and pronounce your opinions. It is very appropriate, I think, and timely, looking into this year's topic of the annual meeting, inclusive growth through better governance and partnerships. You know, ABB is an organization financing long-term development activities through investments, providing technical cooperation, policy advice, and long-term investments means investments in infrastructure, in small businesses, and so on, financial activities, and investments in infrastructure. They start, and we start, and today the proper effects will come after 10 years, 20 years. So you really can profit from these infrastructure investments. They, in a way, affect your future, and that is something one has to see, and I'm sure you will notice what ABB is doing in Asia and the Pacific really is something that should be there for your future lives, for the betterment of lives, and so you should also be able to voice your opinion on what you think should be done and how it should be done. So I think we have chosen a very appropriate theme for your discussion. I wish you good luck, and I'm looking forward to a lively debate among yourselves. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the formulation and assessment of a development strategy and its stakeholders, right, requires not only a scrutiny of policy design and its beneficiaries, right, but also a profound understanding of the context under which we are actually operating. And with the influx of civil society organizations, which was once seen, right, as the panacea to most of the world's development problems, we think that in and of themselves, right, good CSOs are a positive force, right, but put into a structural landscape and context that breeds dependency, inefficiency, right, and even at times corruption, we think that it's time to reassess, right, how we view these CSOs and how we actually create incentives, right, in the environment in which they're actually operating. And I think the question today is this: whether or not CSOs, in their current form, right, please take note of that, have a positive or negative effect, right, on the state's provision of public services. We're not going to judge whether or not CSOs are good or bad to the poor, but instead how they have affected, right, the likelihood of the state fulfilling its role, right. And we think our stance here in the government side is clear. We think that CSOs, right, should take a complementary role to the state. Because when CSOs, right, become the primary means of providing public services and providing for health, let's say, and education, or other services conventionally provided by the state, we think that this becomes overall dangerous, right? Especially given the fact that we think that CSOs are here to actually become a stopgap, right? Temporary inefficiencies and inadequacies by the state, right? We have 3 points for you in this debate. First, we think that CSO organizations, right, in its current form and given the current incentives, right, actually breed dependence and mendicancy on the part of the state. Number one, we think it creates a likelihood of mendicancy because you have to realize that it might not be an active choice of the state, right, to become dependent on these CSOs or these organizations, right? But the incentives that we have created, right, and the environment which we have actually created, right, makes it very conducive for the state to actually become dependent on these CSOs. The existence, right, of too much leeway to deputize NGOs makes it very easy for the state to actually just call upon them, fund these NGOs, and then perhaps hope that these NGOs will fill in the role of the state, right? Especially in developing countries, right, where there's a lot of clamor, right, for provision of state services, but the state is incapable of doing so completely, right? And what happens here is that for the state to feign, like, accountability, or for the state to actually perhaps appease its constituency, what happens is there's a tendency to actually side or perhaps depend on these organizations. Right? That's number one. Second, and more importantly, we think that on this mendicancy point, we think what happens here is the state is rendered incapable of building its capacity to become a steward of development as well. Because we think that for the state to learn technologies in development, for the state to learn management skills, and let's say human resources and expertise in how to forward development in a particular country, we think that there should be a hands-on approach to this one, right? If the state acts merely, right, as a contractor with NGOs and CSOs being subcontractors, right, we think that the state does not gain that technology which it can actually sustain and which it can actually carry over, let's say, to future endeavors or to long-term sustainability goals, right? So hence we think that given the current incentive system, we're not saying that CSOs, right, are bad in general in and of themselves. We think that they're noble and they're good, especially those with a noble cause, right? But given the wrong incentives, right, and given how currently the state has huge incentives, right, to rely on them, we think that that becomes a problem. Second point, right, we think that over-reliance on CSOs, especially with what's happening in most developing countries right now, let's say in Bangladesh, or even let's say in the Philippines, or in many South Asian countries, right, we think what happens is we tend to alienate other stakeholders of the state, or other stakeholders who the state, right, who the state has responsible to as well, right? For instance, we think that CSOs, right, may say that they're actually forwarding a public good, and we agree with that. Right? Let's say, we think that, let's say, clean air, right, is a public good, or let's say free trade or trade liberalization is a public good, right? But the problem comes when we actually put the public interest, right, into perspective. Because we think that the public good that the CSO or the NGO might be forwarding may not really be what the public interest is, right? Because when you forward clean air, right, that might mean you actually undermine efforts, let's say, for low-cost energy, because you perhaps have to be spending, let's say, on technologies in the current period. Let's say when you actually forward free trade and trade liberalization, maybe you're actually harming, let's say, job security of those industries which might be victimized by trade liberalization. The point here is this, right? When you talk about CSOs, usually they're single issue, right? Those single issues in and of themselves are noble, right? But put in the context of competing interests, right, between different stakeholders of the state, we think that it loses the role, the state loses its role of being able to balance these interests, right? Because obviously NGOs will fight for forward their cause and advocacies. And we think there has to be, right, the current structural landscape has to be reformed in such a way that we have we should have more channels, let's say, for coordination and dialogue between NGOs and other NGOs, and between NGOs and government, right? Last thing, and very briefly, we want to talk about how NGOs, right, are not usually accountable to their constituency, they're not accountable to the citizenry, but instead, let's say, accountable to their own support base and accountable to the donors, and it's rather donor-centric, right? And we think that in and of themselves, in and of itself, we think that that's good, all right, in the vacuum. But we think that put in perspective where the state has to be accountable, right, to all stakeholders, minorities, those voices which are heard. We think that it's important, right, that the state is even more empowered in this particular instance. If the state, right, is dominated by the presence of CSOs, that is rendered illegitimate or is rendered irrelevant, right, we think that that becomes a huge problem. Thank you very much.
Want to realize is the fact that CSOs and NGOs are not simply organizations and structures. They are a confirmation and a conglomeration of people who suffer a common circumstance, which is why they came together, because they are aiming for an alternate world order because of the things that they do not achieve in status quo. We think that the debate is about whether or not we're going to be helping out the poor, because that's the primary role of the government. To make sure that the people that they have already failed and the most vulnerable of our societies who do not receive the same privileges as people who enjoy benefits of other upper classes will get the sustenance that they deserve, especially if we're talking about long run. The first thing I want to disagree with Kurt is when he talks about how it becomes too easy for states to just deputize and fund NGOs. Because the question we want to ask is, what's wrong with that? We think if it becomes easier for governments to be able to help out people and to just deputize tasks, that's actually good. Because now we have individuals who find it easier to receive the benefits of the government as well. Particularly if you want to talk about government structures or particular governments who are weak and who don't have the ability to deliver public services right away. We think that it's particularly helpful when you don't have to create a bureau for everything and you can simply source funding through NGOs who study it, who specialize, and who make sure that you get to target people regardless of where they come from, what their background is, and what gender they come from or what class they're going to be coming from. The second thing I want to disagree with is he talks about how NGOs aren't accountable to everyone. They're only accountable to their support base or the particular people they want to help out. Again, we want to be able to ask, what's wrong with that? Because NGOs and CSOs are not built to be substitutes for the governments. If he himself concedes that we want them to be complementary, then it is okay that they are only accountable to particular individuals because the government can be particularly accountable for everyone else. And we think that if you have a multitude of NGOs who are accountable to specific sets of individuals and to specific groups of people, if you look at it as a whole, then there's always going to be someone watching out for particular backgrounds, even if the government neglects to look at them, or other NGOs don't get to specialize in them. That's why we think it's okay. But more than that, we'd like to offer you 3 more levels of argumentation. One, we think that we will accept there will be efficient states who can provide public services on their own. But even under this circumstance, we think that NGOs act as partners and supplements to governments through private and public partnerships, especially involved in both the planning stage and the consultation stage, but even in the optimization of its operationalization. What does this mean? It means that the government is not perfect, and neither are NGOs, and we have to accept that. But we think that they don't have to be independently perfect. Because what NGOs and CSOs provide are then complementary or supplementing the weaknesses of both the government and of the NGO. So where the government fails, the NGO can step in to help out individuals. What does this mean? If you have a government who's weak on research, for example, you can have NGOs and CSOs stepping in and doing the research for them, so you can provide how you want to optimize particular programs that the government wants to operate. Such as, you have 1 million lights, for example, in the Philippines, which are created by teenagers to supplement the fact that while the government can have electricity programs for particular areas, in areas that they can't, then let's distribute lights and let's provide these people a chance to be able to see lights at night and do things so they don't have to be completely unprotected and unproductive. For example, you have governments who are weak in researching on where gender awareness is really lacking and where it's strong, so you can actually distribute where you want to implement it. What's the point? We think that actual programs and implementation are not the only important things, but also creating conditions that are conducive to the optimization of these programs, which can be provided that both of them will care about each other's weaknesses. But second of all, the reality times, it's completely lacking. We think that if you want to talk about corrupt nations like the Philippines, we know it by heart and by soul. That seemingly, we only have programs when election seasons seem to come in, and we're accompanied by tarpaulins that are going to be hanged and said, who did it come from? No thanks. We think that in this case, governments CSOs initiate particular efforts to make sure that everyone is going to be covered. You then have this seasonal type of working a lot more covered because you have NGOs and CSOs covering for the periods of time that governments are not there to help you out. We think that it is still better that there are particular efforts and there are particular times that people can care about. And this is exactly where CSOs and NGOs will come in. If you talk about human rights, for example, in the Philippines, where the government will not particularly strong at safeguarding themselves, you have companies like Transparency International who will step in and say, let's count the number of books that you are giving out, and if it matches the budget, for example, that you really are providing to the people. In this case, NGOs and CSOs act as a check and balance to the claims that governments make to make sure that they don't get to run away with the fact that they are corrupt and they're just letting the people down and good taxpayer money go to waste. We think that in these particular areas, not only do you have a strong political base where you make sure that individuals get to watch out for the government, but you also get the groundwork, for example, in grassroots level to be implemented, like the Deciding Forum, to make sure that if the government does not care about human rights, it does not care about trafficking, then we will be the ones rescuing these individuals because no one else can. In these cases, ladies and gentlemen, we agree, CSOs and NGOs may not be perfect in the government's side, but we think that's okay because the complementary effort, we still have a better world. Thanks.
I don't think we got a very strong speech coming from the previous speaker, considering the fact that essentially she was listening to us the many benefits of civil society organizations that we essentially agree with. Yes, CSOs can provide many great things for society and have done so constantly all throughout the time that we've been funded in human history. But that's not what the debate is about. We're not talking about absolute questions of yes or no, of whether or not these CSOs have an absolute benefit towards society. The question of this debate is about CSOs and their interaction with the state. Because what we argue to, coming from the corporate side, is that the state is an important and key stakeholder that it must be involved in order to develop in any country. CSOs, while valuable, are not a solution on their own. They cannot act upon their own. And that's why we need to assess the level of participation that civil society organizations have, and whether or not they have a positive or negative effect on the state. We didn't get any discussion coming from Valerie whether or not the state is affected in a positive or negative way in terms of based on how a CSO is present in their country.
Point.
We don't think that the
Sir.
responded effectively towards Kurt's discussion of dependence. Please sit down. We tell you that I'm going to talk to you about two things, right? First, I want to talk to you about how the state is a critical stakeholder that is valuable and cannot be removed and needs to be very active, right? And I'm going to tell you afterwards how CSO participation harms that critical activity for these members of the state. Is there a point before I go on?
Okay. Here's the thing. You said that we didn't talk about the state's interaction with these CSOs, and that's bad. But the natural consequence of the state's interaction is benefiting the state. So if you agree with us that it benefits the state, then how is that an indication of bad interaction?
No, we said that in a vacuum it could have some benefits. But compared to the ill effects that overdependence creates, that's something that we didn't respond to. We're talking about how overdependence is likely to take place, and I'm going to show you why overdependence is going to be much worse. Because we tell you that at some point within the history of any country, the state needs to be the one taking action. The state needs to be the one participating in making development happen. The state needs to be the one who makes sure that the economy gets better, who makes sure that it provides education and jobs. And dependence causes a lot of problems, right? Dependence makes sure that the state does not have the technology or the skill or the knowledge on how to develop those areas. And the thing is, that the state is vastly superior on many aspects towards the accumulation of CSOs. We tell you that CSOs are not accountable to balance different interests. If there is a conflict of interest between CSOs, they're not going to settle it. They're just going to be lobbying against each other, thus creating a lot of noise that prevents a solution from taking place. The state, however, has the ability and the authority to decide and make decisions on what's better for the country in the case of conflicting interests. Valid response to that. But we tell you as well that CSOs are not sustainable. Why? Because they rely upon a voluntary and altruistic base. And we tell you that these CSOs relying upon those things means that their presence within a certain community, for example, isn't going to be there all the time. And at some point, the state will need to intervene. And in order for it to intervene, it needs to have strong institutions, which means that it needs to develop on its own. But
Clarification.
The state does have special abilities that CSOs do not. It is simply bigger and more organized in the state. It is more professional than the CSO. It has more authority.
I'll save you.
The ability to have police power. It has the ability to protect individuals from violence. It has all these things that require them to be invested within these countries. Right?
Julian.
So what's the point? The point is that unless we involve the state along with these CSOs, then we're not going to have a good development practice. But we tell you that, as Val said, CSOs shouldn't be substitutes, right?
Here.
But the case is that in a lot of places, all across the world, CSOs are becoming substitutes for governments, especially in areas where the government is not there. There's an overemphasis on CSOs, please sit down, to stay in those areas and to make sure that those areas develop, to make sure that those areas are developed. Not through government action, but through CSO action, right? And we tell you that that's bad because the mendicancy under this paradigm creates path dependence.
Sir.
This means that when CSOs are strong in that area, such as in places like Somalia, such as in places like Afghanistan, wherein it's the local organizations that are running the country and providing public services, it becomes a lot harder for the state to penetrate into those areas and participate and become a member there. Meaning that at some point, the state will not be able to really contribute to those areas because of the over-reliance upon CSOs. And
Clarification.
at some point, well, we tell you that these states, since they are better than CSOs, need to be there at some point. Why does this take place, basically? Now, we tell you that it creates a tug of war for social capital. We say that important in development is our relationships. You need to build relationships with the people on the ground, right? Because it is through this relationship and through this trust that these people become willing to make sacrifices. These people become willing to cooperate and sacrifice their own interests. That you get the information and knowledge that these people have of their own needs and the needs of other people around it. We say to you that building relationships and earning trust is all about that accumulation of social capital. But the thing is, social capital is limited. These people can't build relationships with everyone. And the fact that they build their relationships, their trust, their belief systems upon a reliance on CSOs means that it becomes more difficult for them to build that same relationship with the state. And unless we have that relationship with the state, it is extremely difficult for that company to become self-reliant. And that self-reliance is important if we want these companies to develop. So, what you have to remember, coming from a commercial side, we tell you that if you believe that CSOs are good, that's all fine and good. But if you want development to take place, you need to believe in more than just that. You need to believe that the state has to be in that area. And the only way for it to do so is for CSOs to take a bit of a step back at times and make sure that the state is part of the solution. We're very powerful.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a bit embarrassing because in the final round we hear a glaring and stark contradiction coming from the government side.
must exist in areas like these rural areas that are not targeted or penetrated by the state, because they are better in the end, in the long run. It's better that the state is there. CSOs and organizations probably research, probably are within those communities, probably know the people and know the problem. That's why they're a conglomeration of people who are committed to solving that particular urgency. So we believe that A, it is false. But number two, it contradicts them, because if the state is indeed better, and if the state is indeed better equipped to address these problems, why aren't they there? Why haven't they done anything until then? We believe that this is a stark contradiction between what they want to achieve and what status quo is, and that's why their case can never fly in this debate. Because essentially they say this, essentially this is the same thing as this previous speaker, that dependency is bad. But let's take a look at the motion. In what way does dependency curtail these organizations from accomplishing these public services? Because dependency is not the question, it's not a motion of all the motion is saying is, does it aid the state in delivering services to the poor? Whether or not it is coursed through a dependent CSO, no thank you, is not the question. Even though they've never proven to us that that's a bad thing. That's why we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that since they have conceded that to some points these organizations are complementary, and to some point these organizations are crucial, then they have necessarily conceded the debate. But essentially, there's still one case standing, no thank you, from the other side. This is idea of they alienate stakeholders by the fact that they conflict, by the fact that sometimes there are so many CSOs that they just create noise.
Point, sir.
No thank you. Number one, we believe that creating noise is in itself a value, especially if no noise exists. If you don't have any clamor about a particular issue, that's when there's a problem, because you're never going to solve it. Especially the government that is very macroscopic, looks at the country in a big way, not in a small way. We need these people to create this noise. That's number one. But number two, this completely ignores all of the CSOs that do not have competing interests. For example, what about the people who are against trafficking? I'm pretty sure almost everyone in the world is against slavery. And I'm pretty sure everyone wants to feed people. There are many organizations with many causes that have no conflicting interests and just want to serve the society. This conflicting crisis, therefore, does not exist at any point for these organizations. But number three, we believe that it is this conflict that highlights the problems that the government has to solve. And that is why they are still critical when we think about it in our society. The second idea is this idea of, there's only so much social capital to go around. On the first level, this is false. I believe that social capital, and we believe social capital, is something that can accumulate no matter what you do. For example, the appreciation of a community to any kind of government project isn't limited to a certain cap that I can only be this happy that you're giving me food. That's not true, ladies and gentlemen. If the state treats these people just the same way as these organizations do, I'm pretty sure that these states will be received in the same way and will be treated just as well as any organization. But number two, if the state is so involved in the social capital, then we believe that it is their prerogative to allow these organizations to exist where they cannot. Because he already conceded in his speech a while ago that there are some places where the state cannot penetrate. The problem is, if you have to wait for the state to reach these places, how many people must suffer and die, ladies and gentlemen, before we get anything done? We believe that that is not something we are willing to accept on side opposition. That is why the motion is false and must go down. But before I argue, yes, anyone?
How exactly are CSOs going to get sustainable types of funding once these problems are no longer in the news? Unlike a state that has the ability to tax people and have that sustainable provision of goods.
Thank you. Thank you for that great transition. Because my case is this. The split of the opposition is this. Val already told you about how these people are more targetive. They come from societies that already know the problem. My case, I'm going to tell you about the sustainability and how these people are flexible enough to adjust to current problems and situations in society. Essentially, my first case is the sustainability point. Because we see there's a principal-agent problem that exists in our society. Why? Because if you have the principal on the ground, for example, these small communities, and the agent is the government, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes it is not in the government's interest to protect the interests of the principal. That's why we have so much massive corruption going on. When it's not the state, and for example, I'm the local government unit, I could spend this money and make that hospital, but I think it fits better in my pocket, ladies and gentlemen, and it's more comfortable in my my pocket. I like it there. We believe that when that principal-agent problem exists, so long as the principal, or rather the agent, does not feel the harms that the principal feels, there will be the sustainable issue. We believe that because it is usually within societies and within these societies that organizations pop up. For example, in one region in the Philippines called Naga, where water issues like piping were such a big issue in the 80s, which have been resolved by primary organizations within their own community. We believe that these people who feel the effects of all of these problems are more geared and more sustainably going to solve them because they feel the effects. Like if you're getting slapped every day, you're gonna try to not get slapped tomorrow, right, ladies and gentlemen? It's only human nature. But the second idea is this: why are they more flexible? We believe that with the advent in the 90s and the early 2000s of the Transparency and Accountability Network, or TAN, we believe that NGOs are already filtered and already sorted into groups where they don't conflict with each other. For example, if a group wants to fix something in a particular area and another group wants to do exactly the same thing, we already have networks in place to allocate them to make it an efficient way of solving the same problem, but in multiple areas, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that given the nature of the flexible nature of NGOs, where they can enter and leave areas, ladies and gentlemen, and do the best in areas that need them the most, and given that there are networks in place that allow them to execute these things the best way, and that the NGOs are the most flexible and malleable people to resolve these issues. At the end of the day, we've proven that they're targeted, sustainable, and they are flexible. And that is all we need to prove, that they give public services to the people. Thank you.
The previous speaker sounded like a politician, Government is always corrupt. Those who are in power are always corrupt. That's why we cannot work together. There's a false dichotomy happening in this debate. This debate is not about the state versus CSOs. This debate is about cooperation versus status quo, where the state is being alienated in these societies. Ladies and gentlemen, we will agree with all the things that they said. Yes, the CSOs do provide results. Right? We do recognize that, ladies and gentlemen. But what we cannot recognize is that cooperation does not exist, right? And this is status quo, ladies and gentlemen. So the first question I want to address, right, is cooperation even possible or likely in status quo between the government and CSOs, right? And we heard from my partners that what really happens in status quo is that the way CSOs enter society, as they mentioned it themselves, is that it starts off with a problem. The state is the problem. They don't provide resources, and that's why they capitalize on this, and they build relationships in these societies, and they create mistrust to the government, and that's how they build their stance in these societies, right? Why is that harmful, ladies and gentlemen? That is harmful because we think that even if they say that CSOs do have the capacity and the know-how how to build these societies, we think that that is not enough, but we need to engage with the state. But if the state is being alienated in these particular societies, in these particular villages, for example, then we cannot have that particular benefit. Why is that not possible anymore if we have this type of relationship? What did they say? Their first response was, well, social capital is not limited, right? People can love everybody, that's what Cibor said. That's not true. There will always exist a diminishing marginal utility when we talk about the government's image, when we talk about these people, right? Because the rhetoric of the CSOs is that we cannot trust the state. That's why you must divert resources to these particular CSOs. That's what happened, for example, in Haiti, where during the calamity, most of the international funding went to the CSOs and not into the government, right? And this particular behavior, ladies and gentlemen, is harmful when we talk about cooperation because it creates an adversarial relationship between CSOs and governments. And that's what creates the lack of cooperation.
Point.
And that's why we think that status quo is problematic, and that's why it weakens the state's role in providing services, right? And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the state's role is important because we think that we need to look at the perspective if CSOs really can sustainably stay in the particular society or not. Because what is their case here? I'll call you later, right? They said that Well, CSOs do have the know-how, and we do recognize that. But we think there will always be deficiencies when we talk about CSOs, right? Like sustainability issues. We cannot expect most CSOs to be professional, for example, in the particular areas. There are structural problems that prohibits them from becoming professional, such as the basis for them to actually, for their manpower, it's a volunteer basis. That's why it's difficult for us to trust, CSOs to fully have the capital, the manpower capital to develop their systems. Even if they mention all these big name CSOs, you can expect them to be in all villages in a particular country all the time. We do expect small CSOs as well, which we cannot trust, ladies and gentlemen. They also talk about that they know the villages, right? But where do these CSOs come from? They come from advocacies at first, and that's why they stick to these advocacies, influencing their decisions. When we talk about religious organizations and how they deal with these particular societies, yes, they provide services, but at the same time, there are things that are attached to it, such as the current issue in the Philippines, for example, in Orange Bill, when they accompany, ladies and gentlemen, their help to the poor with antagonism with current reforms when we talk about contraception and introduction to it in the Philippines. It might be the public interest to make sure that we do have reforms when we talk about contraception, but it's being harmed because the main point of CSOs is their advocacies first. And that's why we need to regulate it, that's why we need cooperation, and cooperation is going to be harder if we have the current setup now in status quo. That's why the role of the state is being weakened because of the lack of cooperation. Before I move on, yes?
Are public services such as food, water, electricity, and healthcare only useful if they get coursed through both the government and CSOs, or do they still fulfill state role even if it's just coursed through CSOs?
It's better if it's cooperation, and we want better than good, right? The second question now is, how do we empower the state? Because that question also answers how do we not empower the state's role here. They only mentioned two things. The first one is the idea of checks and balances. Like we mitigate corruption. We agree to a certain extent. But is their means enough and effective? Because what is their form of checks and balance? The way they check and balance government is they alienate them. They tell them that they're corrupt, and that's why they don't enter these societies anymore, right? So their form of checks and balances is that the state should not touch the funds. But that's not how we fix the government, right? You're just providing a band-aid solution. What we want is for integration and for them to check each other when they cooperate. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a better checks and balance, and we cannot have that if there's weak incentives for them to cooperate because of the adversarial relationships between CSOs and the government. The second thing that they said is, obviously, if the government is not there, they provide services. We agree to a certain extent that that is good, right? Yes, government cannot be present in all the time. But what we must recognize is that overall, ladies and gentlemen, there are instances where government can cooperate with these places, right? Can cooperate with CSOs in particular places. But overall, we think that it is being harmed. The cooperation argument which we presented to you is being harmed because of the stance of CSOs, right? And we think that the best way for us to empower CSOs is to remove this adversarial relationship and to be open in cooperation. So what is the way for us to fix this structural problem in status quo? The best way for this is to remove and to decrease the adversarial relationship, ladies and gentlemen, right? And we cannot expect status quo to provide that type of environment because of adversarial relationship which we presented to you from government side. The best way for us to develop is through cooperation and not provide a dichotomy between the state and the CSOs. And that's why we are proud to propose.
We think government side in this debate is being extra sneaky because they said that, well, there's a problem with CSOs only if they don't cooperate. But if they do, we're totally fine with that. Well, what do you want us to say? We want CSOs who don't want to cooperate? Because in status quo, they do cooperate. They operate in a framework of partnership, especially with local government units in delivering services to the people. That was just a claim. They never even said the instances where they wouldn't cooperate. So we think that's not something that's believable. That's not something that is true. That's not something that you guys should believe. So essentially, what this debate boils down into is this. We have to imagine a world without CSOs. And we have to ask ourselves the question, are we better off? Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, that CSOs are good because they echo problems which would otherwise the government would not have even seen, would not even see, would not even respect, or would not even really imagine is big for the people. Because while we're all into economics and inflation and all those big things, little things matter to the grassroots. Like they don't have water, like they don't have food, like they don't have shelter. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, because they echo problems and they direct government in what areas they should go to, and even at times provide substitutes, ladies and gentlemen, they are things that we need to operate as a country. We think, furthermore, that they said there are harms. Oh no, there are harms with CSOs. The first harm is this. They said CSOs have their own interests. They have their own advocacies. But the question you really do have to ask is, are the advocacies bad? Because if they are good, then it's okay, right? So we think there is no big problem with them having their own advocacies. In fact, even governments have them. In a good way, governments and politicians call them political platforms, and in the bad way, they call them corruption. So either way, right, they're gonna be there. We don't see an issue with that problem. Second, they said, well, CSOs aren't accountable. But as far as we are concerned, CSOs are people. They have to follow the laws. They cannot do anything outside of the law, ladies and gentlemen, and something that is bad, essentially, for people. So we think in some ways, maybe not in the legal voting sense, they are still accountable, ladies and gentlemen. But we think, now, I would agree that we have to be average, reasonable people because you have to vote on this afterwards. The first question we have to ask is this. It's really shaky the way they gave their arguments. Because they said, first and foremost, from first speaker, that CSOs are weak because they cannot do it alone. They need the government. But second speaker comes up and says, they're so strong that the government will become dependent on them. My question is, what's your deal, guys? We think you should provide a stance. And we think if you don't have that, you have to go with an opposition side that tells you whether or not they're good, whether or not they're bad, because everything operates in extents and we are realistic people, why are they important? And we think, essentially, even if there are bad CSOs, there are going to be good ones, and you cannot invalidate the work of the good CSOs. First question I want to ask, that was just my introduction. The first question I want to ask is this. Are they really substituting the government? My answer really is not really. Because governments are still the ones who collect taxes.
First point.
What do you want the government to do with the taxes? Put them in their pockets? Of course, they're going to do projects of their own. Of course, we think cooperation is possible between the two because that's their claim. Cooperation isn't happening in status quo. But that's not true. Because cooperation happens in status quo. Who do you think polices these people when they go to far-flung areas? Themselves? CSOs don't have the right to collect taxes. CSOs don't have the right to have their own police. They rely on governments, ladies and gentlemen. That's why cooperation is happening in status quo. And I back that up with an explanation, not just a claim like them. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, even if they don't cooperate, sometimes they have yet to prove why this discourse is bad. Why questioning the government sometimes is bad. Because sometimes, and actually all the time, we think it is good. Because people should be involved. Second question, is there a conflict of interest? We don't think so. Look at the motion, ladies and gentlemen. Public services. Most often than not, governments and CSOs would have the same goal. It's not likely, if you picture it in your heads, to see CSOs distributing water in one barangay and the government will slap them and say, hey, stop doing that. That's not good. Because it is good, ladies and gentlemen. They have the same altruistic goals and we think the government is strengthened, especially when they cannot provide anymore. We think there's exclusive value coming from our side. But even if, ladies and gentlemen, the last question I really want to ask is, where do we promote social capital more? Because we think this is important. Social capital is important because they're not just ends in themselves, but provide a conducive environment for the operationalization of projects, right? Trust, community, etc. But we think CSOs are the social capital you're looking for. Because CSOs are the people. They're people on the ground. They're people from communities, barangays. They're people who have altruistic, ladies and gentlemen, things that they can offer to the government. We think it's only when you have CSOs that you actually make the people feel included. That they don't just have representation when they vote, but also in everyday little things, that they can speak up because they are stakeholders as well. Inevitably, with all my questions, 1, 2, 3, we think, ladies and gentlemen, it's clear. CSOs sometimes may be bad because no one is perfect, but we have to have them. The world is a better place with them, and we think they have a benefit that they can never provide. Thanks.
This is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm just so inspired by these young people. And ladies and gentlemen, right in front of us, we have our future president, vice president, senators, and congressmen, and leaders of this country. Well done. Thank you very much. Okay, isn't that great? That was wonderful. We have, I think we can take two speakers from the floor. Again, just because of time, the floor is open for 1 for and 1 against the motion. Do we have anyone? Shall I call for the 4 first? And if you can just make a very quick and sharp comment. Anyone would like to volunteer? Yes, please. Will you be speaking for, or we have the microphone there?
It seems as though both sides agree on the fact that the CSO and NGOs are interdependent with the government, except the for side is saying that it is a substitution and the against side is saying that it is complementary. Well, personally, I believe that it is complementary. However, I feel that the opposition fails to realize the fact that complementary means that the state's role has to be weakened for the NGOs and CSOs to come into their role to supplement each other, and therefore to create a stronger state effect. I feel the opposition has been focusing more on the state effect rather than the state's role, because the state's role has to be weakened in order for the NGOs and the CSOs to come into their role and create a stronger state effect. Thank you.
Thank you. May we have another one from the floor? Oh, now we have 2. Okay, let me have you first. Yes. And we can have a third. I think
Considering the fact that the debate itself is revolved around the motion, we should refer back to the motion. The motion refers to CSOs and non-governmental organizations. This basically means that, as the name suggests, these organizations are not bound to a particular political area that is bound by the most organized method of organizing our world today, political boundaries. And as such, it is important to consider the extent at which these organizations are focused towards certain groups of people. These organizations are basically entitled to protect humanity, all the citizens that are in the world today. While on the other hand, national governments are more focused towards their people. And as the social contract also suggests, they are bound to protect and promote the rights and welfare of their own people. And as such, I think it is very important to consider in this debate the extent at which these organizations can have a significant impact in terms of implementing and, as the motion again suggests, delivering public services and goods to people in the world today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. May we have the last point, please?
I'll be speaking for the motion itself. So it seems that the opposition side really lives on an ideal paradigm in which they constantly say that NGOs are not perfect, but in which they do not realize that there are imperfect situations in which government and NGOs will not be cooperating to the fullest extent. And this is because if the situation reaches an extent in which the NGO must step in replacement of the government, how willing and cooperative will the government be anyway, knowing that a different non-governmental body will be replacing them? And moreover, we believe that the level of knowledge and specialization that the opposition side pursues has nothing to do, or very little, with the power and ability of implementing the action. And this NGO's intervention will only worsen the relationship between the government and the NGOs, making the provision of public services to the poor even more difficult or to the extent of impossibility. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, before we take a vote, my understanding from Chris Morris is that the winner for this debate will have to debate the debating team winner in India next year. So, I hope that you will really decide based on the argument presented by the two teams this morning. So if you can get ready with your clicker. And by the way, please don't forget before you leave this room, can you give back the clicker? ADB will run after us.
On behalf of ADB, I'd like to thank you all for participating in these debates and to encourage the participants who have actually put on a great show. I have been in and out of all these debates over the last few days and the pre-debates in ADB as well. And I was impressed by the very high quality of many of those debates. On this debate, I think everybody could have strengthened their point by bringing in the issue of legitimacy of the state versus the legitimacy of the CSOs. I believe that was one point that was missed. Talking about legitimacy, I think there is no better person to give away the awards from ADB's side than Dr. Schaefer-Preuss. So, madam, may I request you to come on the stage to give the... I think she has more legitimacy than I have.
May I call the LaSalle team first of all? Where are the... Thank you very much. You did a wonderful job. You will do that. Okay, may I call on, okay, this is Julian, yeah? Julian Bautista. May I call on Pipao Santiago? And Curtsy. May we give this young gentleman a big round of applause again, please. You want to have pictures, Mark? So I think you need pictures. I mean, the two, okay, all together for you. Yeah, you have the pictures. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Okay, the winner for this year's debate, the University of the Philippines team. May I have them over? May I call on Valerie Inting? Pearl Simbulan. And Carlo Borromeo. Again, let's give this team a big, big hand. So you can, yeah, Chandler, you want to be on the other side? Thank you. Congratulations again. Thank you. Thank you, Chandra.
Well, we just say that we were on them in India.
That was what I was told.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we truly appreciate your coming today and your attendance at the very early morning today is really well appreciated. We will see you hopefully next year in India. And I think we have to proceed. We have the time to proceed to the opening session. Thank you and have a nice day today.